Well, hello everyone and welcome to my rather dishevelled looking library. This will be explained later. If you're new here, hello, my name is Chinsia, and if you're not new here and you're one of my lovely regulars, hi, how are you? I hope you're doing splendidly. So today, as you can tell from my dishevelled library, we're actually going to be discussing some book recommendations based on fears of approaching Greek literature. I've had a couple of comments over the years. Now, many years ago now, I actually made a video, like introduction to classical literature, so where to start if you want to delve into it the easiest, quote unquote. But I recently got a comment from someone who said, is there an introductory book before I actually read something like the Odyssey or the Iliad, because I don't want to go straight in because I'm not ready yet. And as much as I really hate this nervousness around the ancient classics, because they are not as hard to read as you may think, there's still people out there who are scared to approach the classics because of this stupid elitism out there. So I thought I'd break it down. So you can check out my introduction to classical video. So if you want to read just general, dive right into classical literature. In that video, I already discussed like the quote unquote easiest text to dive into. However, if you're still too nervous about diving into classical text, or you want to start into reading Greek plays, but you don't know which book to buy, because again, it's a commitment. Do you buy Aeschylus first, or do you buy Sophocles first? Like, which text do you go for first? So I tried to condense down my library into the most accessible books out there that have the biggest range out there in terms of poetry collections, anthologies, all that jazz, as well as the ones with the best explanatory notes at the end of it, which are important. So again, there's also another added complex. Where you start with Greek literature depends on where you're interested in, and you need to hone into your general interest. So if you're someone who, wants to read Greek literature but don't know where to start, ask yourself, what are you most interested about? Are you interested in Greek history? Are you interested in the plays? Are you interested in Greek poetry? Or are you just generally interested in Greek mythology as a whole? Or you may be interested in philosophy. So there's lots of different sections, which I've covered all of them at least here once, with books that I don't see discussed very often. I have picked my more niche texts off the shelves, and hopefully this will answer your questions. So for those of you who are scared to either start with the texts themselves, or you're scared about which text to invest in when it comes to your interest, hopefully this video will have you covered. And quick reminder before I actually get into this video, I'm actually streaming tonight at 8 PM over on Dorian, so if you're going to join me, it's all about my Hades and Persephone myth, so it's relevant to this video slightly. So first and foremost, I don't own any of these books. Actually, no, I own one, but most of these I've actually used from the library, and they're books that not only I recommend, but my own supervisor for my PhD recommends. And that is the very short introductions that are published by Oxford University Press. They are very, very good. There is nothing wrong with starting with a very short introduction. So the very short introduction covers lots of different topics, but I've got them up on my phone, that the ones that would be relevant to you, and I will link all the books I mentioned down below. There's a lot when it comes to classical history. We're focusing on Greek literature in this video, so the ones that will be relevant to you are Ancient Greece, a very short introduction. Aristotle, a very short introduction. Classical literature, a very short introduction. Classical mythology, very short introduction. Classics, a very short, like what is classic? The Hellenistic age, a short introduction. Herodotus, again, for those of you interested in Greek history and how it was portrayed, Herodotus has its own short introduction. The same goes for Homer. I've also done a video on Homer, about who he is, but that's just me self-plugging. And finally, we have the Etruscans and the Trojan War, a very short introduction. So again, depending on what you're interested in, history, mythology, etc., there's a short introduction for that. But let's get into the texts that I actually own. So let's start with the Greek plays, because I think a lot of people, again, plays are not accessible anyway. They're quite expensive for a very tiny book, and people find them hard to read just because it's a different form of reading that we're not always comfortable with. So unless you've grown up in theatre or something and you're very theatrical minded, or you just love reading plays in general because that's your field of interest, very few people go to read a play for fun. However, if you're unfamiliar and you don't know which plays to start with, may I recommend the Greek plays. This is quite a new anthology, and this has 16 plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides. And again, very important, extensive notes at the back. What's important about certain translations is, depending on the time they are translated, some people translate epic poetry and plays, depending on when they were translated, into an archaic language which isn't befitting of the ancient Greek. So some people try to authenticate their translation by going into like oldie worldy language, which isn't related to ancient Greek whatsoever. It's very reflective of the time that they were translated. I'm looking at you, Poe. But basically, people think it's like that. People think the language is very old-fashioned. Archaic language does not a good translation make. But this kind of covers your ground. So if you're someone who doesn't know if you want to read Medea or you want to read Lysistrata and you don't know which book to buy or which translation, this is a solid anthology that features all of them as well as an appendix, and it keeps it in a nice neat order. And if you're interested in reading more about tragedy, because I think most people think of Greek tragedy more than anything, then I can't recommend Simon Critchley's book enough. This is Tragedy, the Greeks and Us. This is a nice introduction to the history of tragedy, how tragedy was formed, and then the plays themselves and contextualization of them, and then you can go into the actual plays themselves. So that's my introduction to Greek plays. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a throw in the water here because it's not common. When we think of novels, the Roman Empire comes to mind. The Romans loved their novels, and there are far more of them than there are in the ancient Greeks. However, it doesn't mean that they're not in there, and it's a majorly overlooked aspect of the Greek literature. So I actually have this chunky book, which is a collected ancient Greek novels by Reardon, edited by Reardon. How the Greek novel works is very different from how the Roman novel works, but again, if you're curious in that aspect of your research or reading, this is where to start, and I would say this is basically the only book that I'd recommend, unless you're someone who's doing a verbatim translation. That's obviously the Loeb library collection, where you can read it in the original text and then read the translation itself or play with the text. But as someone who's not a specialist in either Greek or Latin languages or ancient languages as a whole, I just read books. Cannot recommend this enough. Next, we're going into poetry. So obviously we have Homer. We know Homer. I'm going to reiterate something that I mentioned, obviously, in my first ever video about recommending texts for newbies to the subject. I only started reading classical texts when I went to university to study classics. I never read any before then. I wasn't used to it. I never got taught it at school. I wasn't taught ancient history or classical history at school or classical literature. I hadn't read anything. And when they gave me the text, like, you have to read, Plato's Republic today, you have to read this week Homer's Iliad, they were the first time I ever read them, and I was shocked at how easy they were to read. And obviously I was in the context of I got more time with the text because I'm researching them, but they are not inaccessible in themselves. So again, when I emphasized reading poetry, I'm going to recommend these translations. Now, I recommended different translations of the Odyssey. I normally go for Fagles because I really enjoy Fagles. However, what's fascinating is, again, here we have a contrast. Another thing that's overlooked is translations and translators make a difference. So read how you want. Again, I would avoid the really archaic versions of them. I just find them quite irritating. So I have 3 different translations and translators here. I have The Odyssey by Emily Wilson. She's the first woman to ever translate the Odyssey into English. She's not the first woman. There's been other women across the world who translated the Odyssey into English. But why I've pulled up this edition is not to say that she's better than Fagles in any sense of the form, but this particular edition is a Norton critical anthology, and these texts are really bloody useful. I have 2 versions of this text, one normal one on my shelf and the Norton critical. This is the one that I write my notes in. But I just pulled this down because, again, we have 2 different translators. We have Caroline Alexander. She's the first woman to ever translate the Iliad into English, and she actually happened a couple of years before Emily Wilson. Why it blew up in the news that Emily Wilson had done it when Caroline Alexander didn't, no one knows. We'll never know. And this is Robert Fagles. This is my first ever copy of the Iliad. When I'm reading poetry, I'd rather read it in verse, but there are some editions out there that put it into prose. I am not a fan of prose in my personal opinion, but again, if you just want to read something for the story itself, you may find reading it in prose is easier. So when you're reading ancient texts, you have to ask yourself genuinely, what do I want out of this? Do I want it to be close as I possibly can in the English language to the original experience of experiencing the Iliad or the Odyssey for the first time? Or do I just want to read the story and I don't really care if it's how it was told in, ancient times? You will see differences between translators. It doesn't mean that they're wrong or that they're lying. It's just their creative flair on things. And you'll also notice, and I hate to point this out, the men are more lenient with misogyny than the women are. They chose to translate certain words that didn't exist. And you will see with the male translators that they do project contemporary language into a space that isn't there. So a prime example of the ancient text, which Emily Wilson's actually written a lot about, if you're curious. She took out the word slut. She notices that a lot of men use the word slut when referring within context of Helen, mainly. It's mainly Helen of Troy. They call her a slut. This language isn't in the original Greek, and it makes me so frustrated that I don't read ancient Greek, and it's something I would love to do in the future, because I hate the idea that I'm reading something and then going off someone else's opinion. So when you're reading translators, keep it in mind that actually we're trusting them with a lot of how we read these texts, which goes for the same as everything. Who's translating it will impact, whether they notice it or not. They'll just think, oh yeah, that's the best word. Slut is the best word. When it's not actually a word, a term that's actually in there at all. There's no reference to that. They just put it in there for artistic flair, creative flair, which is a valid thing to do for translators. They're not lying, but you have to take that into consideration when you're reading these texts, that they use creative flair. And going off poetry again, Greek poetry is a very broad subject, but people get, who should I read first? Who should I read first? Well, there's an anthology for that. I just picked up the Greek poems to the gods, hymns from Homer to Proclus, and these were translated by Barry Powell. Now, Barry Powell's little anthology features Homeric hymns, the hymns of Callimachus, the Orphic hymns, and the hymns of Proclus. So we also have the fragments of Sappho that I highly recommend as well. This is a nice introduction to just poetry in general. How did it perform? On smaller scale rather than the epic scale of the Iliad and the Odyssey, etc., which can be quite overwhelming. So wee little anthologies like this are very useful, but this edition that I've got here of Sappho is very in-depth. Again, it has a huge appendix at the end. They explain everything. You can feel confident recommending this. It does give you a lot of context, and this also gives you a wee little context, and you can just get a taster before you dive into individual poetic. Or if you want to see if you like reading poetry from ancient Greece, you may not. So again, good to start with anthologies, etc. I have a whole video on philosophy books, but when it comes to Greek philosophy, I think there's only one way to go, and that's just to read it. And I say this because it is not as hard as you think it is, or that people make you believe it is. It is very, very easy English. The translators in here aren't using fancy words, aren't being prosaic or, very archaic. So there is a book that is quite confusing, which is The First Philosophers, which is an Oxford World Classics book that I have. That did blow my mind. I'm not going to lie, that was like, what are they talking about? Why are they going back and forth? Plato's Republic is very easy to read, and this edition in particular has a lot of extensive notes in it. Just read the bloody philosophy itself. It is not hard. People tell you it is hard. It is not hard. Kant is hard. Immanuel Kant is hard. This is not hard. And then we get to my final stack, which is mythology. If you're interested in mythology, where do you start? There are so many poets writing about mythology, and as you can tell from my videos I've been putting out about myths, there's different versions of every myth. There is no one version of a myth. They would change from city to city, from person to person, from time period to time period. They're not one size fits all, but when there are so many versions of the myths out there, it can become overwhelming. Where do you start? That's where anthologies do come in. So if you are someone who kind of just wants a dictionary of myths, you just want to be able to flick to that particular myth and find out about that myth, then I can only recommend Edith Hamilton's Mythology. Very good. This actually has been recently updated, which is very, very useful. And there's very old Bulfinch's Mythology. Again, they're more encyclopedias of the myths. And I've actually found this one pretty extensive, but again, they don't cover everything. So when I was doing my Heracles video series, she mentioned some of it, and then Bulfinch mentioned other bits of it, and I was going back and forth between lots of different books because each person pulls out bits of myth from whatever sources they use and drops them in there, but no two people mention the same details of each myth. Fascinating. There are some people out there who've compiled everything they know about it and they really squeeze it in, but these I would say are more bite-sized introductions to that myth. And again, when it comes to writing anthologies, the same principle applies. People will only reference versions, potentially they may use, actually when the anthology is coming up, they may use these texts. Sometimes you can see that. So again, keep that in mind when you're reading these texts, that the people pick out bits of the myth that they are familiar with, that they like, that works in their story flow, and they don't want to keep skipping back and forth, and they'll just tell you a version of the myth, and they may not even reference any other details. And like in another edition, this happens. They just tell you one edition. And they may even blend several editions together to make their own edition of a myth. So that's what I'm planning on doing with my video series with mythology. I want to give you like all the different versions as much as possible that I can find and bring them all together in one narrative, so you can know when you watch a video what happens in each myth with different versions of the myth. However, if you just want an easy read with mythology, then I kind of have to recommend the basics. So the two that I would recommend the most is Stephen Fry, Mythos, which I have issues with, and Charlotte Higgins, Mythology, which I also have issues with. I'm not saying these as big fangirls. There are a lot of issues that I have in both these texts, how they present certain myths, etc. However, Stephen Fry, very accessible. You remember the characters. I know a lot of people who listen to his audiobook version of it remember things easier because they remember Stephen Fry's voice. He's got a lovely voice, very good narrator, and he gives a lot of characteristics to it. But I didn't really enjoy that. I found it a bit too gimmicky, but at the same time, I'm just a bit of a boring person, in all honesty. So that's probably why I had issues with it. But it's very accessible. So you want to learn the stories. He does all three. So he's actually done. We have Mythos, which is kind of an introduction to a load of the myths. We have Troy. So if you're scared of reading the Iliad, you may want to start with Troy itself. And we also have Heroes, where, again, he looks at the Greek heroes and explores their stories and narratives. But I'd actually recommend Higgins more, and again, I had a lot of issues with Higgins, which I ranted about over on Patreon, I believe. I've ranted about it a lot, have a lot of issues with this book. But give credit where credit's due. She is the best out of all the anthologies that I've ever read of bringing a connection between all of the myths. So you see a lineage. Why does it keep focusing on my statue in the background? Honestly, Artemis is just taking all the credit right now. But anyway, Charlotte Higgins' edition brings all the myths in a very good quote-unquote chronological order. Oh my god! Obviously, there's no chronology. It's all made up. At the same time, this, you can see family trees very easily through the mythology. I think she's done the best job in terms of bringing them all together, and ironically, yes, weaving them all together. The main motif of this is that they're being woven by different characters. So whilst I have pernickety issues with, the storytelling and not the structure, just the choices that Higgins makes, because again, as I've stressed several times throughout this video, they play with things because they're picking and choosing what they want to present because they can't present it all, so they have to pick. And the same with translators and linguistics. They get to pick the words, they get to play with the words that comes natural to them in their time period with their mindset. Everything is very biased when it comes into the mythology world, and that's something you have to factor in when it comes to classical literature in general. Everything. Translations, retellings, anthologies, etc. Biases, time periods, mentalities will all play a factor, even into translations. So unless you can read ancient languages yourself, you are not going to get a raw experience. You're not going to get your own personal experience. So again, take into consideration that what these writers do in their quote-unquote retellings, but their anthologies, is still very biased in their own way. Higgins, I know, reads ancient Greek, so she did look at certain words and decide on certain things. So there is more weight there, but again, Higgins has her own biases and what she presents. And, whilst I have issues with a lot of what she chooses, I had even more issues with Stephen Fry's choice of language in Mythos. So don't take them for gospel, but if you want to learn about the myths themselves in general, remember that there are other versions of the myths, and these are these authors presenting the myths in their particular way. But at the same time, they're nice introductions to the myths, and then when you feel comfortable, you can go into the classical myths and you can read them from the raw sources, the ancient sources, how different Greeks wrote about them in the plays, etc. And then finally, I'm just going to give one book recommendation for history. Creators, Conquerors and Citizens, A History of Ancient Greece by Robin Waterfield. And I recommended this one because this covers everything in not a baby amount of space either, but it covers a decent. So we have the archaic period between 750 to 480, the formation of the states, which again, if you're interested in then reading about Athens, etc. further down the line, this will be a good primer before you get into that detail. Then we have the classical period between 478 to 323, a tale mainly of two cities. Then we have the Hellenistic period, the Greeks and the Macedonians and the Romans, and that's between 323 to 30. So it's not like a whole history of ancient Greece, but I like how it's broken it down into different categories like that. It's a nice primer for those of you who are more interested in looking at the history of Thebes or looking into the history of Athens. So I mention this because whilst obviously you can't, it's a lot to cram into a tiny book, and I say tiny book for the amount of history that's just covered there, he does it really well. So as a primer for history, I recommend this. You can dip in and out of it, and also it's a good reference for when you're reading it. Say if you want to read a book about Athens more closely and you're not familiar with who they're referencing in that book, you can bump back to this. Bump back, that's a new word. I think that's a real word. Oh well. So you can bump back to this book and read that. So those are my book recommendations for those of you who want to read Greek literature but are too afraid to dive right into it. However, I'm going to emphasize again, as I emphasized at the beginning and in the middle, Greek texts and ancient texts in general are not hard to read. They are not inaccessible. If you have the patience to be a bit slower, particularly when you're first starting out, to take the time to flick back to the back page and read the appendix or read the footnotes, etc., then you will get the most out of the text. But if you want to read something a bit more fast-paced and you're not ready for that stage then these are the texts for you. But thank you very much for watching this video. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible, and until Tuesday I will see you soon for another video. And remember, books save lives, so keep reading.